Welcome, everyone, and thank you, Winslow Society members, for being the heart of everything CFPA. For those of you who don't know me, I'm David Leff. I'm a former board member at CFPA, and I now chair the Public Policy Committee. Today's report on lawmaking under the gold dome of the Capitol details the latest in a long line of CFPA public policy efforts undertaken since the organization's inception. It started even before, a generation before, the Blue Blaze Trail system was even conceived. As the 20th century began, we advocated for a state forester, for control of wildfires and open burning, and creation of parks. Recently, we fought successfully for a constitutional amendment to protect our public lands, and for the passport to the parks to ensure that these cherished and beautiful places are properly maintained. We've also fought for bond money for trails and for open space acquisition. It may not be glamorous or fun, but public policy advocacy is the foundation of everything CFPA does. Year in and year out, we must continue our efforts to protect the natural landscapes we love. Fortunately, we've been blessed to have Eric Hammerling as our executive director for over a decade. I once served as staff to the General Assembly for some 16 years, and take it from me, Eric is one of the most trusted and effective voices at the state capitol. He knows what to do, and he does it well. Please join me in welcoming Eric Hammerling.
Thanks so much, David. What a pleasure to be here, and what a wonderful introduction. And thank you very much for being the chair of our Public Policy Committee, and really our muse as we pursue policy for forests, parks, and trails for Connecticut's future. I'm going to share my screen and give you some information about our public policy efforts. And hopefully you can see everything here, but what I'm going to focus on today is our public policy programs. Obviously, we want to start by thanking the Winslow Society members like you for your incredible support of CFPA. You may not know this, but there are about 128 members in the Winslow Society, and collectively, your generous support represents almost 40% of CFPA's annual budget. Of course, your generous support helps CFPA deliver statewide more than just a strong voice for conservation issues in Hartford that I'll talk about tonight, but of course, a wide variety of program offerings. And I'll just quickly remind you, of course, as we talk about all that CFPA does, we typically use the familiar outdoorsy acronym ACRE to talk about our advocacy, our conservation, our recreation, our education programs. I'm going to just quickly buzz through the CRE and come back to the advocacy piece and really focus there tonight. But just as a reminder, I think many of you know that CFPA is actually a statewide land trust. We have about 2,000 acres of land that we either own or hold conservation easements on and have stewardship responsibilities forever. And of course, as I think you're also aware, one of our current absolute priorities is to try to protect trail corridors. What's shown here is the New England National Scenic Trail in Connecticut. This is obviously not including the Massachusetts portion, but as you can see in red, those are some of the areas on private land that we're working to try to conserve in perpetuity. And of course, you're probably familiar with many of the recreational offerings that CFPA provides every year. Of course, there's the largest celebration of Trails Day that happens anywhere in the country. efforts by our summer trail crew to do work to make sure that trails are well maintained and open for public enjoyment. We work with CCC crews, their hike challenges and running series on the Blue Blazed hiking trails. And of course, you're very familiar with that system, almost 900 miles of trails, really. We say 825, but it really is, in fact, a little bit over 900 miles of trails in 96 towns statewide. And of course, the Connecticut Walk Book is the definitive guide to all of those great trails. And then, of course, CFPA also does, our education programs for all ages. Here's a fun group getting together at Goodwin Forest in Hampton, but our education programs also involve some of our publications like Forest Trees of Connecticut, Connecticut Woodlands Magazine, and much more. But really the focus tonight is to talk a little bit about our public policy efforts. Here are just a few fun pictures from various efforts that we've been working on for a while. But let me really start with an introduction to our public policy team. Whoops, sorry about that. That handsome person in the middle of the screen is CFPA's lobbyist, John Larkin. And I want to give great credit to John because he's the one who is at the Capitol every day. That is when they allow people to be at the Capitol. And he's the one who helps me focus my time on the most pressing issues for forest parks and trails. I wanted to show you just a quick shot of me with my dogs because it is possible they'll make a little bit of noise during our presentation tonight. This is around the time that we have some mail deliveries and fun things like that. And then, of course, to recognize our Public Policy Committee, David Leff, who you heard from moments ago, is the chair of that committee and has been for several years. Board members, Beth Critton, Rich Croce, Eric Lukinbiel, honorary board member, Ralph Scarpino, volunteer, and board members Tom Tella and Dave Terry, all have been outstanding supporters of the public policy efforts at CFPA. The committee really works closely with me and John to come up with the conservation priorities for forest parks and trails every year. And then, of course, I have to include, and this is really critical, we can do all the conceiving of what might be great conservation policies, but without you, without your support, without your willingness to contact legislators when either we need something really good to happen or we need to stop something really bad from happening, you make the difference. So thank you so much for being a part of our team. So I thought it'd be good to start tonight to just give you a little bit of a quick civics refresher on where things are with the General Assembly. The General Assembly started its work this year on February 9th and runs through May 4th. And I'll talk a little bit about what are the logistics that we have to deal with every year. So just in general, there are 36 state senators, and each Senate district represents about 100,000 people. And there are 151 House districts that overlap with those Senate districts, and each one represents about 24,000 people. Every member of our legislature gets elected and often re-elected every 2 years. And we also have joint committees that have a chair of, like the Environment Committee has a House chair and a Senate chair. So the House and Senate hear issues together, but then they vote on them separately. And there are a lot of different interesting dynamics that we work with there. And lastly, it's important to know that we have what's called a part-time legislature. They only get paid $28,000 a year for their work. And that's generally because they're working for half a year in the legislature. Now, of course, they're doing things all year round. and 75% of legislators have other jobs. It's often important to know what some of those other jobs are, because amazingly enough, sometimes the motivations of legislators are affected by the other jobs that they have. Imagine my surprise. Here's a look at the numbers in the House and the Senate. Actually, they are remarkably parallel. In both chambers, there is a 64-36% split between Democrats and Republicans, respectively. That means that the chairs of all of the committees in the legislature are Democrats. Now, if you happen to be a Democrat and you think, wow, that's terrific, that means we're going to have only good things happen on environmental or conservation issues, not so fast, my friend. I have seen in my many years of working on conservation policy issues as many good ideas and bad ideas offered by both Democrats and Republicans. Of course, as an organization, we are not Democrat or Republican. We are advocating for forest, parks, and trails, and we work with everybody to try to get there. So I mentioned that this legislative session started on February 9th, and it actually is a short session of the legislature. They vary between a short session and a long session. Long sessions are on odd years, and short sessions are on even years, like the year we're in right now, 2022. Reason for that is an even year is a re-election year. So legislators want to spend, and this may sound wrong, but it's pretty accurate. Legislators want to spend as little time legislating as possible and as much time running for re-election as possible in an election year. Long sessions are often focused on budget issues. Short sessions often are about issues. But that said, I would say essentially every year is a budget year, and we have to fight for budget items every single year. But this short session is only 12 weeks long, and it is going by really fast. So just to give you a sense of the calendar of where things are, as you can see, there was a deadline that has already been passed towards the end of February, within which bills needed to be raised in various committees. That's probably a good thing, because the more time there is to raise bills, the more bills that may raise eyebrows can be put forward. We are now in this interim area between bills getting raised and then having public hearings. And then what's shown here is a JF deadline. That means joint favorable. That is when committees have to vote bills out of committee to move along the process, or else bills die. As you might notice, some of the key committees that we track very closely, the Environment Committee, the Energy and Technology Committee, the Appropriations Committee, the Finance, Revenue and Bonding Committee, they all have deadlines that are coming up late March or early April. So in the next 2 weeks, there are a lot of things that are going to be happening at the legislature. And I should have mentioned that part of the reason that our crackerjack lobbyist, John Larkin, isn't with us tonight is he's actually spending time at a public hearing that is happening right now. Again, this is the civics refresher, but in a short session, bills get proposed by committees only, and so legislators get to put bills forward in long sessions. But this is a committee-dominated short session. I always find this process interesting because a bill is proposed, they make decisions on whether or not to have a public hearing, and then after the public hearing is when they do the analysis to decide, is this bill constitutional or not? So often there are public hearings on bills that are not yet determined to be constitutional. But then as things wind their way through the process, a bill to be passed has to be voted on the floor of each chamber, an identical version of the bill, before it can go to the governor to either get their endorsement or for them to veto the bill. So here's our favorite bill sitting here on Capitol Hill. And of course, at the end of every session, there are, even if a bill is passed and signed by the governor, there are opportunities to still create some mischief. If the governor vetoes a bill, the legislature can get together to try to override it. But no matter what, we try to celebrate the positive things that happen, make sure we know if there are negative things that happen, and be ready to try again next year, because this is a long-term game. I would hope that if you are interested in public policy issues, you make good use of this resource. This is the General Assembly website, cga.ct.gov. When the legislature is in session, I am on this website every single day, reading the bulletin, seeing what bills are being raised, what committees are having public hearings. At any time during the legislative session, there are 10 to 20 bills that we're typically following to see, again, which are some good ones that we can get over the finish line, and which are some bills creating mischief that we have to watch out for. One of the nice things that is offered on this website is the ability to track bills. So I'll just give you a sense of, if you decide to track bills, and this is a free service that's offered on the General Assembly website, you can create a list like this of bills. You can set it up to send you either texts or emails as various bills move through the process. I won't get into all the mechanics of how to do this tonight, but if any of you have any questions about this or want some technical assistance in getting your own bill tracking set up, I am happy to provide that. Please do reach out and email me at any time. Now, of course, the calendar suggests that it is a linear process to move a bill from concept to committee to vote to approval or veto. But there are exceptions to the normal process that we're always on the lookout for. Typically, if a bill doesn't make it by a committee deadline, it dies. But there are ways around death. As we all have seen, there are bills that might make it through a committee deadline that can be amended. And so something that might have died can be attached to a bill that didn't die. Sometimes a bill that made it through the committee process can actually be completely replaced with language from a bill that never made it through the process. Those are called RATs, but that's a strike and replace effort, and you just have to be aware that a bill that once said one thing might say something else later in the process. And then, of course, there are, and this is another way that bills can be amended, but at the end of the process, when they are passing a budget or amendments to a budget, they will often pass a budget implementer bill at the same time. This can be hundreds of pages long, and sometimes things will make their way into budget implementers. Usually there's only, maybe 24 hours to actually read through a budget implementer. And many legislators will vote on this based on what they are told to do by leadership, but not necessarily that they have read the bill. That's why we have to be on alert at all times to make sure that we are reading the bill, looking for mischief, and identifying that for legislators as needed. Okay, so that's a bit about the process. I'll talk some now about some of our priorities in this legislative session on forest, parks, and trails. But I do want to give you a flavor. This is something that David mentioned in the opening of some of the forest laws, and I'll mention some park and trail laws that have been established over time, largely through the efforts of CFPA, at times also with partners. But you may not know that Connecticut is actually the first state in the nation to have a state forester and to have a state forest acquisition policy, and also one of the very first state forests established in the nation. And that was something that CFPA fought for in its early days in 1901. Today, every municipality has a tree warden and has the ability to establish a shade tree commission. Again, going back to 1901, it was interesting to see that this was one of the first efforts that CFPA pursued as an advocate. But I include 2016 here under municipal tree wardens because although every municipality had to have a tree warden going back to 1901, it wasn't until we updated the law in 2016 to actually require that a tree warden knows something about trees. Long story, but we think that helps to elevate the ability of tree wardens to be great spokespeople and advocates locally for their tree canopies. One of the first forest fire laws in the country, and certainly the first in New England. Some of you may be familiar with the Public Act 490 program today, which is the Use Valuation Law. But even before PA 490, back in 1913, CFPA was advocating for this bill, this law that was a 100-year commitment by a landowner to keep their land as forest. And there were some penalties going out for 100 years if a landowner changed use of their property. So, at the very early days, CFPA was advocating for forest conservation. 1991, the Forest Practices Act was really a landmark piece of legislation, which it ensured that our state certified foresters, forest harvesters, forest harvest supervisors, all had requirements to pass tests, had continuing education requirements. And this bill may have been one of the most important laws that we have in Connecticut to really elevate the skills and overall forest management efforts in our state. In 2013 and 14, we worked long and hard to ensure that as electric utilities were doing vegetation management at the local level, they had certain public notice processes that needed to be followed. And then today, of course, we are working on issues around forest resiliency, forest management, and climate. Again, a little bit of history on park and trails related laws, but in 1971, really important law for allowing private landowners to host trails on their property was the Recreational Liability Law, which basically protects landowners as long as they don't charge a fee and as long as they don't go out of their way to hurt someone. They have excellent protection under the law if someone were to have a trip and fall on their property. This is the still today probably the #1 question that we get asked by landowners who host trails on their property. Hey, what's my liability? And we're able to say there's a very strong law that protects landowners and has since 1971. David mentioned the bonding and support for greenways and recreational trails. And of course, in 2009, this was a year after I started at CFPA, the New England National Scenic Trail received a federal designation to become one of 11 national scenic trails in the country. 2017 was the landmark passing of the Passport to the Parks, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. David also mentioned the constitutional amendment to protect public lands, which is all about transparency and ensuring that the legislature can no longer sell, swap, or give away public lands without first holding a public hearing, having a public vote, and really ensuring that there is sunlight throughout the process. And today, in terms of priorities for parks and trails, of course, we need to protect the Passport to the Parks and funding issues, but also it's a work on providing incentives for landowners who are hosting trail corridors. Okay, so if you're looking at policy from the perspective of a legislator, these are the types of questions that they're often asking themselves. What is the challenge we're trying to solve? Will a change in policy make a difference? Or is there some other thing other than a policy that would make a difference? Maybe it's a matter of education. Maybe it's a matter of enforcement. They always want to know, is the issue urgent? Which is a way of saying, do we have to deal with this issue now? Or can we kick it down the road a little bit? And then lastly, is the issue politically divisive? Even though there are certainly issues that are raised that are politically divisive and are at times done for, to make political bonus points, those are rarely the types of bills that make it across the finish line. And fortunately, the forest, park, and trail issues that we work on are rarely politically divisive. That said, if there were a politically divisive issue that involved forest, parks, and trails, we would be right there to try to make sure that good things happened. All right, so let me take forest, parks, and trails one at a time. I'll talk a little bit more about forests than the others, because this is something that we obviously have a long history with and are in the midst of doing a lot of work on forest resiliency right now. So again, looking at it through the filter of what a legislator might be wondering, what is the challenge with forests? Well, we have, most of our forests in Connecticut are privately owned. Most are of relatively small acreage, 10 acres or fewer, and we have an aging population of forest landowners. In fact, if past trends on this have held, about 90% of forest landowners are older than 55 today. That means that there are more and more forest landowners each year who are thinking about leaving forest land to heirs, selling for conservation, or selling for other purposes. So this is a critically important time to talk with landowners about the future of their forest land. There are some conserved forest lands owned by the state or by land trust, and there are some easements on some private forest lands to keep them as forest. There are also some incentives that exist. I mentioned the Public Act 490 program, which allows, it reduces the tax burden for individuals who have more than 25 acres of forest and are keeping them as forest. And then there are state level grants to help conserve forests for the long term, though not enough funding ever. Connecticut is, relatively forested state. I believe we're the 14th most forested state in the nation with 59% forest cover. But we need to do better because in New England, we are, towards the bottom of the list. And what are some of those issues that have occurred to our forests over time? Well, if you look at our forests over the last 30 years, we've actually had about 130,000 acres of large core forest be lost. Now, this does not mean that 130,000 acres of forest have been turned into pavement or into housing developments. That means that they've been, fragmented into pieces of 500 acres or fewer. And so the large core forests that existed in 1985 are now much smaller forests. We have to, even though this number has leveled off a little bit in recent years, there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done to keep our core forests intact. We also have an issue that you may have read about in terms of inequity with where our urban tree cover is located. So if you think about our cities, and this is New Haven, if you recognize the typical kangaroo shape of New Haven here, you can see that on the right is showing where tree cover is located. On the left is really showing you the relationship between tree cover and ground surface temperatures. What that means is, tree cover keeps the ground cooler. There are fewer health-related issues that have to do with excessive heat in those areas with greater tree cover. Now, unfortunately, those areas that are most red and have higher surface temperatures tend to be lower income, more black and brown dominated neighborhoods. And so there are some major inequities in urban tree cover that needs to be remedied. Just to give a sense, even though we're at 59% forest cover across the state, if you look at Bridgeport or Hartford or New Haven, and these numbers are more than a decade old, and actually some of these numbers have decreased since this time, but you see, urban tree cover at much lower percentages. Again, this is an issue that needs to be remedied, both in terms of maintaining existing tree cover and planting trees for the future. And of course, climate change is now, a major threat that is making all of these issues with forests a bit worse. More intense storms and other weather stressors means we have more stressed trees. Some of the longer growing seasons, which may seem like a good thing in some ways, it also means we have more invasive plants, more forest pests, more deer who are eating seedlings and making it harder for our forests to regenerate. There are lots of other issues with increased decomposition, so lower soil carbon, less carbon storage. All of these things are linked, but really the key thing to take away from this is that climate change is making it harder to have resilient forests for the future. And so you might ask the question, is taking action today on forest conservation an urgent issue? Well, if you think about the various benefits that forests provide to us, improved air and water quality, climate adaptation and mitigation benefits, wood products, wildlife habitat, the whole range of benefits that forests and trees provide, we need to act now to ensure that we have those benefits in the future. So if a legislator says, well, do we have to deal with this now? I would hope the answer from you, and certainly the answer from us, is yes. Now, there has been a lot of interest in the future of forests. There have been some, 3 recent reports that have come out in the last 2 years. I was fortunate to be the chair of the forest subgroup of the Governor's Council on Climate Change. We have our state forest action plan, which came out in 2020. And in early 2021, report on the top 63 actions that need to be taken for a more resilient climate in the future. These are, fortunately, there were 8 of those recommendations connected to forests, and it's largely through our efforts that continues to be an area of focus. One of the overriding concepts coming out of the forest resiliency recommendations was that we need as a state to have a no net loss of forest policy. And it's a pretty simple concept in a way, basically 5 different elements to this policy, right? We want to increase forest cover and tree canopy where needed. So you heard about some of the issues with fragmentation and our urban tree canopies. We want to avoid losses and conversion of forest whenever possible. Certainly make sure that we're not incentivizing that. We want to make sure that there is funding and educational information to make sure that we can protect and steward resilient forests. We might also think about something that New Jersey and Maryland and a few other states have really looked at is making sure there is compensatory mitigation for the loss of forests and trees. And then we want to do a better job of monitoring our forest and tree carbon inventory so that in the future we can have a good idea of what we're storing on the land, so that means less carbon in the atmosphere. This last fall, I was fortunate to chair a group of 15 organizations that developed some recommendations on, we call it the Perfect Future effort. Perfect Future standing for the Policy on Resilient Forests for Connecticut's Future. My colleagues will laugh at me because I'm the acronym guy, but I think this one works pretty well. We would like to see a perfect future. And let me give you a couple recommendations in our report that we hope will be adopted in either this legislative session or more likely than not this next legislative session. One of the recommendations is some of you may be familiar with the Global Warming Solutions Act, which lays out some specific goals for Connecticut to attain in terms of greenhouse gas emissions. But all of the focus of the Global Warming Solutions Act is on the transportation sector, the building sector, the energy production sector. There isn't any attention of the important role played by working in natural lands in sequestering and storing carbon. We would say that is negative emissions. We have tried with a couple different bills this year to suggest some language that would accomplish this and ensure that the state is actually tracking and reporting on its working in natural lands and the carbon inventory associated with them. We'd like to see some new goals for statewide forest cover and urban tree canopies. Love to see a 1% increase in our statewide forest cover and a 5% increase in our urban tree canopies, all by 2040. We could go deeper into that recommendation if you would like. We're encouraging the state to really take seriously this concept of compensatory reforestation to mitigate actions by state agencies that result in the loss of trees and even utilities for the loss of trees, in particular along distribution lines in municipalities. And then there was also a recommendation to update the invasive plant species list with known threats to forests. There are a number of invasive plants that are currently sold commercially, which can have impacts in forests and are having impacts in forests. And that, again, is something that needs to be remedied. Okay, moving quickly to parks. So there's been a lot of talk about the Passport to the Parks, which we think is a fantastic program that we advocated hard for. It was passed on Halloween night in 2017 and started in 2018. What it does is, we all contribute to our state parks through a $5 per year per vehicle registration fee. That generates about $20 million for state park operations and maintenance. And perhaps most importantly, it takes away the gate fee that used to be paid when you would go to many state parks. If you think about what the fee used to be at a shoreline park like Hammonasset or Rocky Neck, that was a $13 fee per vehicle for just one visit. Now, for $5 a year, which is paid through your vehicle registration. Most people don't feel that and get the benefit of both supporting parks and having access to the parks year round. There was on Valentine's Day an announcement made by the governor that they're going to be putting $55 million into state park infrastructure. We certainly support that. About $25 million of that is federal funding coming to Connecticut to do a lot of things. That's ARPA funds, federal funds being put to use for our state parks, which we think is a great idea. There's certainly lots of needs. If you look at our state parks over time, and going back to the early 1980s, you can see a really important and troubling conundrum here. This looks almost like supply and demand curves, but park visitation has gone through the roof. And in the last few years, and in particular, since the passage of the Passport to the Parks this last year, about 13 million people visited state parks. But over the same time period, we've had a reduction in our park staff from almost 205 or so park staff back in 1984. The most current staffing count is 83. So from 205 to 83 park staff over the last 40 years. That is sad. And as you might imagine, we have had many things happen over that 40-year period. There are more parks, there are more responsibilities for park managers, and yet the park staff has been cut by more than half. And as some of you are familiar, we also have in this current year a retirement cliff that before July 1st, there are 45% of the staff who are eligible for working in parks and wildlife management areas and forests. 45% are eligible for retirement. We think many of those people will retire, despite the announcement that you may be familiar with from this last week, where they did offer some bonuses to encourage people to stay in state employ. But it's, I would say, too little, too late. And we've already seen a mass exodus from DEEP for some of the staff who have done a lot of amazing work maintaining state parks and forests and wildlife management areas. There is some perhaps good news as a part of all of this, assuming that these positions are replaced. Working in parks, forests, and wildlife management areas. This is an opportunity to get younger, to get more diverse as an agency, to bring in some new blood. But we are definitely concerned about the loss of institutional knowledge. And there are lots of facilities. If you imagine some of the historic state parks, it's helpful to have someone who is really knowledgeable about those facilities and to allow them to mentor someone coming on board is really important. There's also some good news recently on this issue that we've mentioned before of seasonal park maintainers having hourly rates that are way below market level. Up until this announcement that was made last week by the governor, the starting in right now, the cap on park maintainer hourly salaries was $14 an hour. As you may know, $14 an hour starting on July 1st of this year is actually the new state minimum wage. So they were really not effectively competing with the municipalities and others who are hiring seasonal workers to do a whole host of jobs. This increase, this announced this last week, will increase by up to $4 an hour, the hourly rate of seasonal workers. And this is huge. Again, it's a little late. Typically in January and February is when they are hiring seasonals for the season. Here we are mid-March. But we're hoping that DEEP can catch up and make sure that we have people in the field to maintain our state parks and other public lands. And then quickly on trails, and then I'll open up for questions. And I would just encourage you, if you have any questions, there is a Q&A bubble at the bottom of your screen where you can put a question, and we'll have an opportunity to talk a little bit about your questions at the end here. But in terms of trails, some of it just boils down to funding. There is a Recreational Trails and Greenways Grants Program at DEEP, which is getting some funding because of CFPA's efforts. I'll just put it that bluntly. CFPA is the reason why this program exists and has funding. However, the interest in recreational trails has just gone through the roof. And in this last fall round, where they put out a request for proposals, DEEP received 65 applications totaling $22 million. But unfortunately, there was only $3 million available to give out grants. So there were, about $10 million in quality grants that weren't able to be funded. There is a bill, HB 5291, which will increase the bond authorization for recreational trails that was recently heard by the Environment Committee, and we'll keep working to ensure that there will be bonding available for recreational trails in the future. And then lastly, we wanted to try to incentivize private landowners to host trails on their properties. And as you know, it is if a private landowner is thinking about selling their property, the next landowner may not be as positively inclined to trails as was the previous landowner. And so we're really looking for ways to incentivize landowners for them to make a long-term commitment to protecting trails. SB 129, which was raised in the Planning and Development Committee this year, would essentially allow municipalities to adopt an ordinance to be able to abate the property taxes for a landowner who's hosting a trail. Now, of course, it wouldn't be on their entire property. It would just be on the corridor of the trail on their property. But we think this would be a nice way to say to a landowner, thank you for your willingness to host trails, and give them some financial benefit for doing that. So I covered a lot of information really quickly. If you went to our website, you can see our 2022 state conservation priorities. You can see the testimony that we've been offering on a whole host of bills. And again, I would encourage you to either give me a call or send me an email. And if you have any questions or want to find out ways to get further involved. But again, I want to thank you as members of the Winslow Society for your amazing support of CFPA, and open up for questions. So I'll end the slideshow here and see if I can see what you might have put into the Q&A. All right, I see a couple questions in the Q&A. So one of them asks, what about all the clear cutting that DEEP does itself and encourages other landowners to do? So that's a good question. We are definitely trying to find, because there are certain types of wildlife that, benefit from having habitats that are what they'll call, young forest. So that does involve cutting trees and opening up areas for habitat for critters like New England cottontail. We would say that everything has to be done with intention, and everything has to be done in public, and everything has to be done with transparency. So I would say, there are opportunities to weigh in on how various properties are managed. On state forests, there are forest management plans that spell out over the next 10 years what might be proposed for management. On wildlife management areas, there are wildlife habitat stewardship plans that are put forward. And I would say, these are not just plans that sit on a shelf. DEEP is using them to, manage public lands in various ways. And I would just encourage people to get involved enough to, do some research, see what's being proposed in different areas. And if those are activities that you're concerned about, or if you think that CFPA should be concerned about as well, please get involved. Find ways to, inform yourself and let us know. And another question is, how can we redirect solar installations from core forests to rooftops, parking lots, and brownfields? Very much appreciate the question. And I would say that's 100% the orientation that we take towards solar installations at CFPA. At the very least, we have to make sure that our state is not incentivizing the loss of forest for solar installations, and in instances where there is no opportunity to put solar on those hardened surfaces, which are certainly really the preference, there should be a requirement of compensation for either in the form of acquiring forest land that will be maintained as forest, or there are other ways to incentivize planting of forest or planting of trees in urban areas. So I think that that's an area where there's a lot of opportunity for improvement in Connecticut, and it's something that we think can't happen soon enough. There is a process that's underway right now within DEEP called the STEPS process that it is looking at ways to both generate renewable energy and avoid impacts to forest lands in particular. I will just note that there has been a lot of study on farmland for looking at ways that solar might be compatible with certain farm uses, and I wouldn't be surprised if there is more that happens on that front in the next couple years. But I still haven't seen a way that solar can be compatible with trying to protect forest land, in particular core forests. So I very much appreciate that question. Have one other question, and I see another note being put in the chat. So I'll just read this and respond. Okay, I have questions about preservation of species in state forests and parks. The local state forest is currently without a hunting policy. Hunting is very unpopular with the general populace in the area, but native plants are much admired. As you probably know, nature creates a natural opposition here. This is not a legislative issue yet, but how do we get people to make the connection between overabundance of deer and loss of native species? Very much appreciate that question too, and you're right on target. We have certainly seen in forests that overpopulations of deer can create real damage, especially at forest regeneration. Now, of course, if there isn't an overpopulation of deer, then deer can live harmoniously in forest land. But in those areas where there are overpopulations, hey, deer are just doing what they are intended to do. They're eating, they're trying to survive. As I mentioned earlier, because of climate change, deer populations are actually surviving at higher rates through the wintertime than in the past, right? It's not getting quite as cold. That means that deer are, in particular, in some areas where there are overpopulation problems, continuing to create a lot of damage to the forest understory and the forest's ability to regenerate. I would say that it's hard to generalize and say that one solution to managing deer or managing forests is always the right way to go. But I think the better people understand what the dynamics are of their local forest leads you to considerations of, in some instances, allowing hunting at certain levels, in other instances, not. But I would say as an organization, we are not opposed to hunting. We are definitely much in support of having healthy forests in the future. Another question was, are you still pursuing a bill to allow municipalities to use a conveyance tax to support open space purchases? So that is a concept which has been brought up a few times before. Last year, that concept ran into some really stiff headwinds, and we heard from legislators they just aren't going to consider that as the solution. We will come back to it. I think it's a good idea. I think it should be considered. But this year, we know that no legislator was going to touch that in an election year. Despite how we feel about this, the real estate lobby was very strongly opposed. And even though I know there are realtors, in fact, some maybe even listening to this webinar right now, who would be supportive of this kind of conveyance fee that's optional by municipalities to generate some funding to conserve land and even help to improve housing values. It just was politically something that was not going to work, despite our interest in seeing that concept go forward. So it will come back. It may be in a slightly different form, but if we're thinking about a way that municipalities can generate funding locally to support land conservation and trail management and lots of different outdoor recreation interests that communities want to invest in, there needs to be a way to generate that funding, and we think that that was a good idea. So, oh my gosh, we are right at 7 o'clock. I'm not seeing additional questions, so I want to thank you again for your great support of CFPA, and I'll turn things over to Jim Little to close us down and entice you with the next Winslow Society event.
Eric, thank you. And I want to thank Dave Leff for providing the introduction. And more importantly, or most importantly, I want to thank all of you for attending tonight, because this really is an important aspect of our mission. And I want to thank all of you for your tremendous support. The Winslow Society makes a huge difference for CFPA, as was stated earlier. Our next event is going to be on May 18th, and it's going to be an in-person event. So we're very excited about that. When we were planning this, we had to do it on Zoom because of all that was happening with COVID. But on May 18th from 5:30 to 7:30, we're going to gather at the New Britain Museum of American Art for again, a great gathering. And in order to view a wonderful exhibit that is there called The Poetry of Nature, which is an exhibit of the Hudson River School works at the New York Historical Society. And it will be, if you've been to the Art and Nature event, food and drink, great company, and the ability to see some really beautiful art. That art which you would have to ordinarily go to New York to see, but also the New Britain Museum has a wonderful collection of its own of the Hudson River School. So I hope save the date will go out, invitations will go out, and we hope that you'll be able to join us and enjoy it. And actually we can gather for the first time in a long time. For those of you who are interested, I have to put in a plug. There's going to be a fun program down at the Preserve in Old Saybrook, which is organized by our Winslow Society member, Kathy Connolly. And it is going to feature Dennis Quinn, who is going to be talking about some critters in the mud, and looking at some of the vernal pool life. keep a look on our event calendar and look for the save the date. And again, I just want to say thank you very much for your support and for being a part of this evening's event. And if that's it, Eric, I think that we can shut down.